this, as we go through Kings, you know, it talks about kings, it talks about prophets, it talks about lay people, and the key to it all, you say, well, this is stuff that's 2,800 years old, you know, really, what's it got to do with my life? And I guess we're coming to see that it's essentially a story about choices. God puts choices before an array of people and says, this is my best plan for your life. Believe and have faith, obey me, trust, and you'll see that plan fulfilled. Disregard it, go left, and when I say right, and there are consequences. And so the focus is on what choices are we making day to day. You know, are we believing God's promises? Are we acting on those promises? Are we trusting Him even though we're going through a dark time or it's confusing? Can we believe that He has our best at heart? And His purposes, His plans really are loving, even though at the time it looks the opposite. So let's keep that in mind. What do we mean? Again, I asked this before, but how would you define faith? What is faith? A working definition of faith in God.
Believing without seeing.
Believing what without seeing?
Believing in God, or believing in His promises,
Okay.
without actually, you know.
So it's not a blind leap, is that what you're saying?
Right, yeah, you're not just gonna, you know, walk across the street and say, God, you know, please keep me from getting hit by a car, walk across the street in front of the car. No, it's believing that something's gonna happen, that He's gonna keep you safe, especially from yourself, at least from me.
I learned when we were in China that you're crossing about an 8-lane road, and I was told the best way to do it is just start walking. Don't look to your right or to your left. I said, you're kidding. He said, the thing is, if you make contact with the eyes of the driver in the car, then it's on you. But if you just start walking, they see that they have to stop. That's the theory. And I walked across the 8-lane road with
Real
masses
fast.
of cars. And, well, you have a general sense of, okay, and hope for the best, and you just start walking. It's
That's
quite an
it.
experience of trust and faith, yeah.
People do that around here too.
Some people drive like that.
Yeah, drive like that.
New York, they do it all the time.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people in the hospital that were right.
Dead right, yeah.
That's right.
For me, faith is having a certainty in God's best interest for you, regardless of what your circumstances
Yeah,
are.
that's good, yeah.
Well, Jesus said to Thomas, right, you have faith because you believe, but because you saw, and blessed are they that believe and have not seen, which means us.
So here we see faith at work. The opposite, disbelief in contrast to genuine faith. And so let's have that framework in the back of our minds as we look at different individuals. And I know you covered the end, chapter 6 down through 24, but let's just pick it up again by way of review. And remember, in chapter 6, Elisha has been, with God's help, has been reporting to the king of Judah that the Arameans, the Syrians to the north of them, were planning a raid and to avoid certain places for their safety. And after a while, the king of Aram said, there's a mole in this, in my courtyard, in my court. And you can't figure out how they're getting this information, somebody spying or what. And so anyway, he had planned, a series of sneak attacks, and they failed. And he was really upset. So finally, in verse 11, it says, this enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, tell me, which of us is on the side of the king of Israel? And they said, none of us, my lord, but Elisha the prophet, who's in Israel. He's the one who's the inside person who's given this advanced information and spoiling our efforts. And so he issues the command to these soldiers to go find Elisha. Let's get this guy and take care of him. He's our problem. And so off they go, and they surround Elisha. He sent horses and chariots and strong, and they went at night and surrounded the city, which you looked over. And then verse 16, all of a sudden the servant of God, and we assume that it's at this point that it's his longtime helper, and gone blank on his name. Gehazi, thank you, yeah. Anyway, he's frightened. He said, look, what shall we do? You know, we're surrounded. And so in verse 16, Elisha says, don't be scared, don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And this is a working definition of faith. How do you get there? How can I make that statement from this?
I often think about, when I'm out and about, and maybe I'm talking to somebody, or, I just know that God is present, and that I know that I can't see. I believe that there's angels around, they're ministering servants, and they're there. I just know that I can't see them. But I have confidence that God is right there. He's an ever-present help in time of need, and He's just right there. I have confidence in that.
Greater is he who is in us than he who is in the world.
And where's that from?
First John.
John chapter 10.
First John chapter 4.
Oh, sorry.
Verse 4, yeah. And faith is essentially, it deals with things hoped for and things not seen. And so faith is the conviction of divine realities as well as divine resources. So when two people are looking out, Gehazi, the servant, and Elisha, and what does Gehazi see?
He sees all the king's horses and all the king's men.
Yeah, he
You
sees,
see the natural,
yeah,
and the other one see the spiritual. So
Yeah.
that's the faith. And faith, but it's just, you can see behind the natural realm, and a servant of the Lord, and by the experience of through the years, he was, very clear the God that can rescue in many situations. So he must be have that experience before.
good. So Gehazi sees a problem, but Elisha looks and he sees a solution to the problem.
But I think part of it is, and it's, I don't know, it's your framework, is your expectation. So, I mean, it's like they say, you look at a glass of water, is it half empty or half full? So I think, the person with faith looks at it as it being half full, whereas maybe the person without faith looks at it being
Yeah.
half empty.
That's good, Ron, yeah. So it's this faith is this awareness that there is a divine reality beyond, as you put it, Joe, the natural. There's a supernatural. And as you put it too, George, there's spiritual reality. God is there, and at the same time, there's also His promises for divine resources that can enable us to face a challenge or to meet a need. And it's confidence in those divine resources coupled with a belief in the divine realities. So let's pause and pray and commit the evening in our study as we look at faith being worked out, especially as we get into the story of the famine in Samaria and the different, the king of Samaria as well as others and their response to a difficult situation. Bill, would you like to lead us in an open prayer?
historical events, that we would be able to, each of us in our lives, relate them to circumstances that we know of and have been in or are in, and that we may rise up in faith and believe in what you are doing. We ask this in Jesus' name.
Thank you so much. Okay, so, anyway, God does open the eyes of Gehazi, and suddenly he sees the spiritual realities that Elisha had already seen. And, but I love the story. Let's pick it up from, well, did you go through the end of that section, that story?
I think I looked at the video, and I think we finished up on around 23,
Okay,
I
fine.
believe.
Yeah, okay.
Correct
So
me if I'm wrong.
anyway, the king said, well, what do we do with all these soldiers, these Syrian soldiers that we captured? Shall we kill them? And what was Elisha's take on that?
Nope, Peter.
And why in the world would he do that?
He said, would you slay those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow?
But what was the purpose behind that? What was what was the message he was trying to convey?
Let's be friends,
Okay.
gain their confidence.
And they weren't taken by force, right? They weren't taken by force,
No.
so why do you need to,
Well, they were down there on a raid anyway.
Yeah.
so
Right.
It was a
Right.
hostile raid,
Right.
obviously. But suddenly they're feeling like fools, you know? Here they suddenly discover they're in the camp of the enemy and
Right.
saying, how in the world did we get here?
right?
Perfect opportunity to wipe them out, eliminate that. But by feeding them, a transaction takes place, or several things take place. Think about that first. What else do you think God was trying to, the message he was trying to say to the king, and what he was trying to say to these Syrian soldiers?
Mercy.
And that, whatever they do, God's gonna do it better, whatever they try to throw at Elisha.
Okay. I think for the king, the Samaritan king, Joram, he's trying to help him see that he needs to rely on God and his power and his resources, not on his army and his capabilities, and on the gods that he's put in place, the Baal gods and so forth. He needs, that there's only one true protector and provider for northern Israel. We'll see, here he's acting as their protector. Next chapter, we see what the consequences when they disbelieve, and also that ultimately he's their provider. But also for these men, it's an act of grace. And he wants them to understand that they were saved, they survived because of the goodness and graciousness of the God of Israel. But what's interesting to me too is in terms of social customs, there was another factor at work here. And in Middle Eastern culture, when you invite someone into your home, what's the parallel message that goes with that besides feeding them?
Welcome,
That they're safe.
welcome.
Yeah,
They're a guest,
yeah. They were bound in a sense by social custom because when a friend offers hospitality and extends the gift of hospitality and protection to them, they in turn, you know,
Have to.
come in, reciprocate. And so in a sense, they were socially bound as well as morally bound not to attack. Well, later on, they forgot that and they came at him anyway. But it was an interesting play here that, and he wanted them to understand, God wanted Joram especially to realize that there was a God in heaven and he was subject to that king and no one else. He wasn't able and should not make his own decisions and plan and trust in his own resources. And that was a hard lesson for these kings of Israel, the northern kingdoms, to get. So let's move on.
But I think
to-
also in history, if you look at like Alexander the Great and all these guys, when they conquered people, okay, if they were able to keep some of the local presence there, okay, first of all, they wouldn't have enough resources if you, to deal with all this other, so there's a practicality, I think, behind it too, to get them to be on your side, rather than trying to manage them as captors, you know?
Well, the other situation too, if he went in and slaughtered all these soldiers, you know, then there would have been a little blood match.
Yeah.
Right.
That would have been a little something.
And then so you'd want retribution and
That,
then,
well, that's what the Old Testament's about, they would want
Right,
blood, you know?
right,
It's interesting, I mean, this isn't an exact comparison or parallel, but you think of at the end of World War II, Germany and then Japan,
right.
our enemies, how did we treat them?
We rebuilt their factories and pointed to a better way of things and slaughtering people.
Was a difference after World War I versus World War
Exactly.
II,
Exactly,
and the outcomes have been completely different.
exactly.
I think they learned their lesson because they put the Germans' nose in it in World War I. It didn't work out.
It didn't work out, exactly.
But we still made them pay retribution up until the 1970s. They never paid, we know, they were told they had to pay back some of the expenses for the war, and the amazing thing is, it wasn't until sometime in the mid-70s that that debt was canceled.
But now, you can go to Japan and you're seen as a friend. You can go to Germany and Americans are
Mm.
basically seen as friendlies. And there's a sense in when you offer hospitality and protection. That's, you know, there's this interesting quote that in New Testament, you know, when you, by heaping coals, Jesus said, when you love your enemies, heaping coals on a person's head, you know, love them regardless. What in the world is that all about?
For instance, ik had a tremendous passage in the book of Genesis. Remember when God wanted to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? So Lot have invited was the divine, those the angel they come to bring judgment to the city. So and they want to protect them. Even one of the people they abuse them sexual or say even they want to willing to give his daughters to. For the people of the Southern to protect their guests, so
Yeah,
that's.
right. Sodom and Gomorrah, yeah, the same principle, social.
And we use the phrase like kill them with kindness, right?
Yeah.
And so in so doing, you know, they've got to deal with what's ever churning inside of their own heart, you know, because they've been treated well.
It's gotta be different going into battle against a guy that in your mind you've just got raged up that he's evil. But it's gotta be different after you've broke bread with him and served him food. And now, 'cause, you know, these guys are hand-to-hand combat. You know, this isn't, you know, like you're shooting them with bombs and gun. They're looking them in the face as they're fighting them. And I wonder how many of them are thinking, you know, I fed this guy. That's gotta be kinda head games on both sides.
There you go. So let's pick it up in chapter 6, verse 24, and read through the end of this chapter. Would someone please? The story continues. Some period of time goes by.
I'll start with it. Sometime later, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, mobilized his entire army and marched up and laid siege to Samaria. There was a great famine in the city. The siege lasted so long that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver, and a quarter of a cab of seed pods for 5 shekels. As the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out, "Help me, my lord the king." The king replied, "If the Lord does not help you, where can I get help for you? From the threshing floor? From the winepress?" Then he asked her, "What is the matter?" She answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give up your son so we may eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son.' So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give up your son so we may eat him,' but she had hidden him." When the king had heard the woman's words, he tore his robes, and he went along the wall. And the people looked, and there underneath he had sackcloth on his body. He said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today." Now Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. The king, excuse me, the king sent a messenger ahead, but before he had arrived, Elisha said to the elders, Don't you see how this murderer is sending someone to cut off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold it shut against him. Is it not the sound of his master's footsteps behind him? While he was still talking to him, the messenger came down to him. And the king said, "This disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?"
The story will continue in chapter 7. And let's set the scene. A famine comes to Samaria. Why?
Disobeyed God.
Judgment?
Yeah, on the surface, it looks like just the Syrians, again, attacked because they've been long-term enemies. But God had also said, obey me, live in the land, and you will dwell securely. And so we know right offhand that the fact that there's a famine means that there's a spiritual factor, a spiritual cause behind the political, just the, you know, the current situation with Syria. And the whole army was there and sealed off the city, and there was a great famine. Anybody looked up and see what, you know, how much a donkey's head would be sort of worth, or a cab of seed pods, what the equivalents would be for today? You weren't curious? Okay.
80 shekels of silver, 80 shekels of silver sounds a lot, even back then for a donkey's head.
I mean, how, you know, enticing does a donkey head sound like for supper?
I would probably throw it in the dumpster.
Depends how hungry you are.
It's mostly bone.
What's annoying or whatever is like the woman who gave up her son.
Oh,
That's like,
terrible, just unbelievable suffering. And so the donkey's head was obviously one of the least nourishing and most repulsive parts of this animal.
What they do with the
And
rest of
and
the
it sold
donkey.
for about
It's
2
got
pounds of silver. And a half pint of seed pods, normally this was animal fodder, animal feed. And it cost about 2 ounces of silver. So it's outrageous prices for something that's basically, you know, not even dog food hardly. Yeah, pretty grim, but as you said, the tragedy. And so what was Jehoram's response to this?
Maybe trusting God, it was his example, maybe is the cause of the judgment, because again, you say, oh, now I'm capable, so can you blame him God because, but maybe the judgment is because of it.
Hmm.
what is if the Lord does not help you, where can I get help for you?
Mhm.
Yeah, the king blamed Elisha and not himself.
Yeah, why did he blame Elisha for what was going on?
Because he's the only one he can take retribution out. He can't go to after God.
But Elisha represents as a man of God.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
represents.
Yeah, he became the target of his anger because he was visible and there. And he had made statements and promises and had done miracles that, and it's sort of like, why aren't you fixing this? Why are we having to go through this? You know, you did other things, but why not helping us here? So his anger turned towards Elisha as representative of God in this place, blamed him for the failure. Yeah. And he's not the only king who blamed the prophet for famine. Does you recall something that happened a few
Yeah.
chapters
Moses.
earlier?
Yes.
Yeah. Elijah, remember? Elijah and Ahab,
Yeah.
yeah, drought for 3 years, and suddenly, you know, he's the fault. And he was accused of being a troublemaker. That's how Ahab addressed Elijah.
Dan, I'm just thinking that sometimes today when people are wounded by something, they blame the church, you know?
Yeah.
And they have anger inside, you know, for religious institutions, yeah?
And blame God, yep.
Yeah, a lot of people blame God.
Mm.
So here's the king who's really upset. So he decided enough of this. And is he coming to kill Elisha or to drag him out and make him somehow do something to fix it?
His head.
Hmm?
cutting his head off.
Yeah, Elisha describes him as what? Here. Look at verse,
Murderer.
verse 32. See how this murderer is sending someone to cut off my head. So, Elisha is, in one sense, he's in danger.
But he's after him for choices he made. So for example, he's the one that negotiated a bad deal with the woman.
Yeah,
I mean, killing his son first, you know, or even why even killing his son, right?
yeah.
That's a choice he made.
Yeah. And so he comes and with anger and rage, and obviously what tipped the scales was the story of these two women, who one had killed and eaten their son, and the other one had renamed. And that would be a horror story that would, you know, bother anybody, even a king like Jehoram. So, let's go on into chapter 7.
And that was predicted
Yeah,
in Deuteronomy.
that's right.
I just read it.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
Good catch there.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Elisha does make a statement, and let's read it in chapter 7, just the verse 1 and 2. Someone read that for us?
Sure. Elisha replied, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a seah of the finest flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." The officer on whose arm the king was leaning said to the man of God, "Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of the heavens, could this happen?" "You will see it with your own eyes," answered Elisha, "but you will not eat any of it."
So here's two choices. Here's two people with the question of you know, faith in God and His promises is at stake. And so, how does the officer that, the sort of guard or the, you know, I don't know what you would call him, but the one who's assisting the king, what was his response to the statement of Elisha?
Doesn't believe it's possible.
Yeah.
Elisha tells him, "You're not gonna eat, you're gonna die. You're gonna die in the famine." Not
He
good.
said, even for the Lord himself shall make windows in heaven, all these things being, so he don't believe it, and that never can happen.
Right.
Oh, it's interesting with the two women with the sons. One killed the son and ate him. The other one hid the other son. It reminds me of, was it Solomon
Yeah.
making that decision? The
Yeah.
woman says, cut him in half, and the other one, no, let him live, give it to her. The interplay of those two things. Her faith wasn't too strong, the one that ate her son.
Tragic, terrible experiences.
I think it's interesting, this last piece, it almost is implicit the law of supply and demand in economics. It's not, I mean, when you look at it, say, well, you have to get more in order to get the price lower in terms of the supply. I think it's kind of interesting that 2,000 years ago, that they were even thinking about that.
So here it is again, his
Price goes down, the
faith
supply goes
is,
up, right?
is believing that there are both divine realities out there, that there is a God, and there's also divine resources available. And that's what actualizes faith into our lives, is believing in His promises, and that and God then brings His resources as needed into our experience. And this was a tough one. I mean, Elisha makes this statement. I mean, they're in famine. I mean, desperate state. I mean, think of the people in southern Gaza. You know, the level of starvation and mothers having to make choices about children and what to do. It's indescribable. And yet, he makes this outrageous promise. Hear the word of the Lord. Tomorrow, the price of things is going to dramatically change. Meaning what? There'll be food available.
Right.
And so disbelief says, ain't happening. And faith says, if God said it, I trust it will happen. And so then we see the response. And let's go on in chapter 7, picking up in verse 3. And go, let's read down through verse 9.
Now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. They said to each other, "Why stay here until we die? If we say we'll go into the city, the famine is there and we will die. And if we stay here, we will die. So let's go over to the camp of the Arameans and surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, then we die." At dusk they got up and went to the camp of the Arameans. When they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there, for the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a great army, so that they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and fled in dusk and abandoned their tents and their horses and donkeys. They left the camp as it was and ran for their lives. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of camp, entered one of the tents, and ate and drank. Then they took silver, gold, and clothes and went off and hid them. They returned and entered another tent and took some things from it and hid them also. Then they said to each other, what we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. So let's go at once and report this to the royal palace. You want me to continue?
No, let's stop here, yeah, thank you. What were these lepers, why were they out at the city gate outside?
Again?
They are, clean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, according to Mosaic law, lepers had to be separate, and so they were outside the city, outside of the normal protection. But why does he tell this story about deliverance through the experience of 2 lepers?
Yeah.
What's behind this? do you
It's
think?
kind of amusing, it's almost like a shift in the story, going from all this horror to suddenly you have like these clowns tumbling over themselves in a place full of food and silver.
But the first clowns with consciousness.
Yeah.
But it just shows you in an era of famine. Okay, here you have these 2 guys that they didn't have a lot to lose.
Yeah,
They had leprosy, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They said if we go in the city, we die. If we stay here, we die. They go in this other camp and they get chased away. All of a sudden, they're whining and dining type of thing,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
The side story of the Beatitudes.
How does that happen?
They're poor and begging for food. They wind up getting all the food and drink they want.
It's the
Well-
Western confession of God. Use always the weakened vessels, those ostracized, and they go on the side, and use those to really have the food and plant, and they have the one they give it the good news to the king. So use those real outcasts by in this case by disease, and they are the ones to the first, to get the spoils.
It's interesting, I mean, here's the question of choices and faith. And, you can talk about it at the 36,000 level altitude. But here's down on the ground, 2 guys with no hope, no nothing. And yet we hear of their story down there, of what faith, of God's grace, His provision, in the nitty-gritty of life. He picks 2 of these nameless, hopeless guys and puts them into His Word and says, see what I can do for them, and don't you think I can do even more for you?
What I find interesting is that they evacuated that area because they only heard the sound of an army, they didn't
Right.
visualize it. Was that God doing that part? And there was really nothing happening over here. They just like, we're out of here, let's go.
Yeah.
Which history they can do them.
Yeah.
Korea, they did that.
Well, and you wonder if these 2 didn't have some kind of faith, because when they're out there basically gonna die because the town won't take them. But yet, as soon as they find all the supplies, the first thing they wanna do is bring it to the people that want them dead.
Well, not the first thing. They started hoarding it
Well,
for
yeah, but I
themselves
mean,
first, and then they
it
thought
didn't
twice
take
about
long.
it.
It didn't
They
take
thought
long
twice.
for them
They
to,
grew a conscience.
Yeah, they grew
Yeah.
conscious,
yeah.
yeah.
But there's some lessons that I think God wants to, bring home to us as well through their experience. So something amazing happened. Yeah, they heard the sound and off they went, thinking they were about to be attacked and so forth. And they ran in fear and they left everything behind, you know? And so that they reached the edge and they went in, they said, good night. Look at this. Talk about meals on wheels. Here it is, you know? But as it says in verse 9, finally after they gorged themselves, and we're thinking about where do we hide this? Like, where do we hide it? They don't even have a house. And they said, this isn't right. And so what can we learn from their response here? What are some applications for us from these lepers and their choice to share the good news?
Follow your faith no matter what it sounds like, or what you think it's gonna be, you know.
Think about how much you need. I mean, my sister says to me, we share, you know, in the family, we say, we have everything we need, you know, and more than we want. Share it.
I also think that this applies to us in the sense that we have heard the good news of Christ, and that we need to share it, not keep it to ourselves, just go out and share it with other people.
That's right, exactly right. That's a powerful, I think, application for us today.
And I think the other ones, the people that were there that had all the food to begin with, okay? They didn't really, to me, it's kind of amazing the fact that if you have all this food, you hear a few sounds, and there's all this famine all around you, and they have a few sounds, and they leave, it's like they almost took that for granted, that they had it, you know what I'm saying? Because I mean, I would thought you would put up a little bit of a struggle if that's the only food around, type of thing, you know?
Well, they were obviously supernaturally terrified.
Yeah, right.
Something scared the
Right,
out of them.
Yeah.
right.
Scared the confidence and trust and swagger. You know, we got these guys, and they realized they were about to lose their lives, and they ran literally.
I mean, basically, you have two guys that conquered, right?
Yeah, okay, so let's see what happens when they come back in. So let's pick it up in verse 10, and let's read down through the end of the chapter.
So they went and called to the city gatekeepers and told them, we went into the Aramean camp, and not a man was there, not a sound of anyone, only tethered horses and donkeys, and the tents left just as they were. The gatekeepers shouted the news, and it was reported within the palace. The king got up in the night and said to his officers, I will tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know that we are starving, so they have left the camp to hide in the countryside, thinking they will surely come out, and when we take them alive, we will get into the city. One of his officers answered, have some men take 5 of the horses that are left in the city. Their plight will be like that of all the Israelites left here. Yes, they will only be like all the Israelites who are doomed. So let us send them out to find out what happened. So they selected 2 chariots with their horses, and the king sent them after the Aramean army. He commanded the drivers, go out and find what has happened. They followed them as far as the Jordan, and they found the whole road strewn with the clothing and equipment the Arameans had thrown away in their headlong flight. So the messengers returned and reported to the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. So a seah of flour sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley sold for a shekel, as the Lord had said. Now the king had put the officer on whose arm he leaned in charge of the gate, and the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died, just as the man of God had foretold when the king had come down to his house. It happened as the man of God had said to the king. About this time tomorrow, a seah of flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. The officer had said to the man of God, look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of the heavens, could this happen? The man of God had replied, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat any of it. And that is exactly what happened to him. And the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died.
So here again, choices. We see faith or disbelief at work. And it's like, whom will I trust? What will I believe? How will I respond to a promise? It's interesting, come back and all this it's interesting that these four lepers, in a sense, I think probably represented the people of the northern kingdom in their disbelief. They were all in desperate need of change and redemption. And so the lepers were physically impoverished, but it represented many of the northern kingdom who had turned from the one true God to their Baals. And as a consequence of that was that they were now spiritually starving as well as physically starving. But here's God graciously doing something as a major sort of object lesson of the difference between trust and obedience and disobedience and disbelief. So,
But I think the interesting thing is, so when the guy said, like, gave his economics lesson that, gonna be supply, prices are gonna go down, people are thinking, what the heck's gonna happen?
Yeah.
It takes whatever, 12 months for grain and all this
Yeah.
stuff. So they're thinking in the conventional terms
Yeah.
in order to change the supply, yet God comes around and creates this whole other situation where they just get it from the Arameans, but it still had the same effect. So I think it's just kind of interesting how what was predicted, the results happened, but in a non-traditional way of how they probably were thinking about it.
good, yeah. So it's interesting, how about the king of Samaria's response?
He thought it was a trap. He thought it was a trap.
Yeah.
Everybody goes in there and then they come out and they kill everybody, or they just
What does that say about him, his spiritual condition?
lack of spiritual faith, whatever, does not trust in God.
Even after the enemy has sort of disappeared, and yet he can't believe that maybe this was an act of God and that God had done something graciously on their behalf. And so he comes up with this, well, we need to make sure, trust but verify. But he doesn't trust, he just says, let's verify. It's a trap. And so he sends out two chariots. It's amazing now how there's only 2 horses that are viable at this point. They haven't been eaten. And off they go. And what do these 2 chariots and their officers find?
Everything littered.
Hmm?
No, everything was littered from the army
They
retreating.
just like threw this stuff away.
Do you know approximately how far it is from Samaria to the Jordan River?
It's a distance.
It's about 25 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, there was a huge army apparently that had surrounded Samaria. It said Aram mobilized, back in verse 24 of 6, it says, then Hadad, king of Aram, mobilized his entire army. We're talking about thousands, I assume, had come down. So it was a big group of people, and off they went. And imagine 25 miles of stuff being just tossed aside. Anything that weighed down would slow them, they just jettisoned. And,
But the funny thing was, okay, they're in retreat, but it's not like they have this big army following them.
Yeah,
Yet they're
No.
giving up, most armies would just, if they're retreating, try to take as much of the stuff with them. They just were,
Yeah, but they don't know. They thought they heard the chariots.
well, I guess that's true.
I mean, as they're running in their head, they're probably hearing the chariots.
Yeah, right, I guess that's true.
I mean, they're trying to beat feet as fast as they can.
it was a loudspeaker. There was nobody out there.
But actually, yeah, the king didn't have any faith, but he was still concerned about his people.
well, sure.
I mean, he didn't just send everybody out. Maybe it was a trick. We read before where a leader did a really bad job at something as a commander. So militarily, he was right on target.
It was an act of caution, but behind that really was a disbelief in
Right.
what God had promised, yeah. So off they went and they find this, And what about the man who had made this rash statement? It ain't gonna happen.
Yeah, he got stomped on, he was trampled by the crowd.
Yeah. And so stories are told and retold, you know, and we learn a lot through people's stories. You get around Jim Miller, you learn a lot. He just.
I was wondering why you called me rabbi the other day.
And so, do you think this story was passed on and shared?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah. And so you say, why did God, you know, plunk this chapter down in our Old Testament?
You know, I can't help thinking about the manna in the desert and the quail, and how God has an infinite number of ways to make things happen. He's just saying, believe me, and I'm gonna do this. So it's just like Ron said, it's just so extraordinary the way that he did it.
Right.
You know, it was not within a planting cycle. I mean,
Yeah, right,
you
it's just,
know, God just-
if you pick 10 ways how it's gonna happen,
Yeah,
this would not probably make even 10.
right, and God's got infinite more to make things happen.
And he uses means, we know that. He sometimes, he'll heal or he'll provide through people, and normally God works through means, people and circumstances. But there are times when he just steps in and does something extraordinary, as we said, to demonstrate. I say, occasionally God likes to show off. He says, you ain't seen nothing yet, wait till you see this. Yeah. And so, anyway, here's this officer who just blatantly, right in the face of Elijah, says, I don't believe it. Just don't believe it.
And the word of the Lord through the prophet is authenticated, so he's really well established.
Yeah, when God's word goes, like Isaiah said, for the mouth of God that spoke, so it's like propelled from the mouth of God. That's why this confidence of this prophet, you know, very clear on this book was God's book, so we have no doubt about it gonna happen, so.
So I guess, you know, the question to me is, in what areas do I trust God, but what are the areas I struggle at times to really believe or to trust? A problem comes up, a need is there, something goes wrong, and my first reaction is, how in the world are we gonna fix this? Or after a while you say, I give up, it ain't gonna happen, you know? And I know you love the world, God, but I don't think you care about little old me.
Is it possible when you come to a situation where you've experienced it before, you already had at least a partial, if not complete answer from God, but if it's something that's never occurred before,
Yeah.
I think the past passages 2 Sundays ago, 3 Wednesdays ago maybe, and that was Thursday morning. Pray and then wait, silence. Wait for the response, wait for the correct directions. And I think that probably is the difference between knowing what to do straight away and not knowing what to do.
Wait on the Lord.
All else
Still
fails,
wait,
pray.
yeah. What do we mean when we say faith can grow?
It's a learning process. It's not something that all of a sudden, poof, it's there.
Yeah.
It has to be developed, I think.
Yeah, I believe we come into faith as infants. I guess what Paul says, you can't feed an infant, you know, a steak, I'm paraphrasing, you gotta give milk first. So as you grow in faith, you learn more, you do more, you believe more.
When I was a child, I did childish things. When I became a man, I put away these childish things.
Problem is, we don't become a man until we're 60.
Yeah, right?
I can't answer that question for you, Jeff.
You think about answered prayer,
was thinking the
we
same
forget God clearly answers a prayer, and that's a faith builder. It's like, wow, God, and then to believe Him again, you know, next time. That's why I think fellowship is just so important, that we share the testimonies of what God is doing, because it builds up our faith together. And, you know, God did it for Peter. He can do that for me too, right? Yeah.
Most of the time God ordained those trials. is part of to build our faith, and the way you respond is the way you can move forward in your faith or stay or remain a child, like Jeff said. Oh yeah, a lot of brothers and sisters, they start with a lot of good experiences of conversion, you know, and well, they never, the only thing they recall was that time when they are converted, but since that time nothing grew because well, they sabotage God's work in the life. It's a trial, and you can learn with a trial, or not learn anything, or you become bitter or even mad with God. So you always will be a decision to be until the trial runs the full course, and always be a blessing. So it's not easy when you're waiting. You can wait a day or 2 years, 3 years, and you be in that situation, you know, when you see sometimes any hope. But God is working. Sometimes the test is that to wait really until He is ready to move.
Are there things you're willing to do today that 2/3 of your life, because I don't know how old everybody is, but 2/3 of your life ago, you wouldn't have considered? So I'm 80,
Yeah,
and age 25, 30, I
That's
wouldn't
good.
even have thought about it.
that's a good point. And I think we all realize that faith grows in the sense that you go through an experience and you trust God and you see an answer to prayer or something provided, and you think, wow, I guess God is trustworthy, or I can bring anything to Him. And then new challenges come and you say, oh, I don't know if it'll work this time. And then you may walk away and say, it ain't happening, or you may say, okay, God, you did it here, can you do it again? And you see it happen, and it builds and builds. And I think, I like the way, I trust God now for things that I couldn't trust Him for 50 years ago, as a young Christian.
It's good.
Well, and God does it in a way that forces us to look at faith. In other words, I can say to God, I have a problem. And then God says, well, turn it over to me. And I say, okay, I'll turn it over to you. But then after I turn it over to Him, I keep worrying about it and trying to figure out, and God's sitting there going, well, I'm not gonna do nothing until you figure out how to turn it over to me. And then once you finally achieve turning something over and it works out, well, then the next time it's a little easier to say, okay, this time I mean it, I'm gonna turn it over. And we don't turn it over right away, but we don't kick quite as bad. How many times I've had a problem where I say to myself, I need to do this, but I don't wanna do this, so I do this, this, and this. And then in the end, I have to do that. And then you reach a point where you're like, okay, I know what I gotta do, and you kinda just do it then.
That's good, there's a couple of statements that are easy to say, Old Testament promises, you know, one is, roll your burdens on the Lord, and He will sustain you. Roll your burdens on the Lord, well, what does that mean? And you say, oh yeah, okay, but what is it? It's like you say, you can roll it on Him, and then the next minute you're rolling it back.
Yeah.
You know, and it's really hard to put it there and then leave it. At the same time, you know, Peter says, casting all your cares upon Him, because He, what?
Cares for you.
Cares for you. That's one to put under your pillow at night when you put your head down to sleep.
Jesus said, in this world we have trials and tribulations, so we're not gonna be spared. But shut up, I'll overcome the world. So if you really are a follower of Jesus, we're not gonna escape trials, but He goes with us, and He really, if you rely on Him, you go always with through. That's and the more you surrender our life to Him, more the freedom really comes when you and any avenue of you don't surrender, you'll be avenue for Satan target there, because it was a part. It's like the Roman soldier. You have all Paul give that image in Ephesians chapter 6 about what you're gonna do to fight the enemy. But if you see the Roman soldiers in the back, is any protection at all. When you turn the back on that, you are totally exposed to the enemy. That's why the Roman soldier go always forward. He never turn back. That's the purpose. When the protection become when you feel just turn your back in God, so you'll be vulnerable. So, as even though in the spiritual warfare, so we gotta rely whatever God put the weapons you are available for us. Because more you do God's work, more will be the enemy fighters. So will be a war more intense and more intense. So
Yeah, Satan's not gonna go after somebody that is not spiritually strong.
exactly.
He's gonna go after the spiritually strong.
I couldn't help but have a flashback to a little over a year ago, was it March, when Father Joe announced
April.
April. And for those of us who were sitting in the vestry that evening, it was sort of like a major shock. But, I'm sure in the weeks that followed, a lot of people said, what's gonna happen here at St. Paul's? Is it gonna fall apart, or, are people gonna start leaving? There were a lot of understandable fears and anxiety about the outcome. And yet here we are, a year plus later, and have we fallen apart? Well, some of you look like you've fallen apart.
That's our age thing.
We're over
again.
that. That's an age thing. That's-
A year older.
Clock goes in one direction.
No, I don't think.
But, think about how God has provided. Decisions were made to trust God, that He's the Lord of the church, the head of the church, that He will provide what we need. George was sitting there scratching his head, how in the world am I gonna fill the pulpits on every Sunday, Wednesday morning? How about everything, we lost our sexton as well, sadly, and there was a lot of things we thought,
Oh, Patrick too,
Patrick, yeah.
our music,
yeah.
some of the music.
And yet, God has provided. Has it always been perfect? No, but have there been balls dropped? A few. But nevertheless, here we are, and we're doing well, and by God's grace. So, as we look ahead, we're taking a step ahead, and we'll see who the Lord provides as our next priest in charge, but I believe He'll provide what we need. Any other things before?
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting, all these food stories, or, like the feeding of the 5,000s, and all this kind of stuff. I think, there's always the parallel about being the spiritually hungry and getting that satisfied. But the other thing is, eating is one of the basic human things. It's down to the basics. If you can't eat, or that type of thing, you don't survive. So it's not like you're asking for riches or anything else, that you're asking for the basics.
Really good, yeah.
And it's also one of the things that, no matter how you look at it, whether you got it through here from the abandoned troops, or even if you raise it, at the end of the day, God has to have His hand in growing the crops or growing the animals and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a connection with that it gets down to these basic human needs, that you basically need God to survive.
And also it is spiritual need. For Deuteronomy 8, and Jesus quoted when He was tempted, says, "Man not live the bread alone." So we need more
Right.
than bread. So you need both. You need to feed, as you need to feed our physical body, you need to feed our spiritual needs.
But for me personally, reading all these Old Testament stories, it's really put into perspective for me, looking at how we lived and how the rules were and how the earth was. The reason for Jesus and the meaning of the New Testament.
Right.
It really puts the New Testament in perspective by understanding everything in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's good. All right, thank you. It was good interaction, good contributions, illustrations. Any prayer requests or anything that's on your heart that you?
Yes.